Welcome to the Partners in Digital Health Institute Startup and Early Career Incubator Writing Bootcamp, where we empower members to amplify digital health solutions to drive more constructive dialogue to accelerate a new global health era. I'm Tori Sinai, founder and publisher of Partners in Digital Health, and excited to moderate our inaugural webinar featuring guest speakers Pierre-Alexandre Fournier, CEO, CAR Technologies, Keith Thompson, CMO, Neurologics, Robert Mathias, Executive Director, ISMPP, and Dr. Paul Barek, Lecturer, Senior Advisor to the Dean of Jefferson College of Population Health, and Professor of Sigmund Freud University in Austria, and Honorary Professor, University of Queensland, Australia. Today, our global panel of experts will share why and how disseminating research becomes a currency of exchange. Let's listen in now to learn more. Hello, and thank you for joining us today and our panel of experts. My name's Tori Sinai, founder and publisher of Telehealth in Medicine Today and Blockchain in Healthcare Today. And our discussion topic today is guiding startups to understand the value of research, publishing research, and the benefits of doing so. So we're going to get right into it with our panel of experts and begin with our first question. Do startups need to conduct research? I've spoken with many startups across the globe, and many of them say, well, they already have a product and market research. So also, I already have a white paper on my website, for example. Do I still need to publish research in a journal? And well, can I just use that white paper to republish in a journal, for example? Some really are wondering what the impact will also be on their plans and funding needs. So is there a cause and effect here? Rob, why don't we start with you?
Sure, thanks, Tori. So just to start off, we absolutely do have to have research conducted when we're looking at different products and services and so on. It's the basis of the work that gets done. What I think is a really interesting part of your question, though, is when we think about white papers or different types of ways we can disseminate that research once it's conducted. You'd asked in particular if a white paper is just enough. Certainly, it's important to get the word out, and white papers can do part of that. But it's the peer-reviewed journal process, and it's actually publishing items or publishing research that end up in a peer-reviewed journal that makes all the difference. You may ask yourself why. Well, peer review is the gold standard. And so when you publish something in a journal, it gets, number one, it's been reviewed by other members of the scientific community, which gives it credibility and it allows it to basically be more respected from a public perspective. Once you have that conducted and the research published, then it gets picked up in many other places. And that's one of the benefits of going to journals for overall publication.
Thank you. Let's go to our editor-in-chief on the Telehealth in Medicine Today journal, Dr. Paul Barek. What are your thoughts, Paul?
I think partially this begins with semantics. What is research? And I think we fail to understand that research is not some highfalutin, corny head kind of thing, but research is simply a rigorous way to look at information, to understand relationships and interrelationships, essentially to understand if your assumptions are valid. Calling it research seems by some to somehow put it aside from what we do every day, which is trying to validate our reality. So if we call it research, or we call it market understanding, or we call it insights into my clients, those are all forms of research. Having said that, what's clear is that some forms of knowledge inquiry are highly biased, and others are much more representative of a broader audience. And by the nature of how we spend our energy, we can't ask everybody in the world the question, so we have to sample. Research is simply a mechanism, a toolbox to understand, does our sample represent the rest of the community? If it's 5 people or 50 people or 10,000 people. And that toolbox has stood us well for hundreds and hundreds of years. So first of all, I think that's really important to understand that I believe that one of the reasons why startups fail is not because they don't publish things, it's because they don't really understand the market, because they make flawed assumptions, because they don't know how to collect data properly. Call it research, call it something else, but that's at the heart of it all. And the next question really is, what should you do with that data once you get it? You can hide it in a vault like IBM used to do, or like IBM did, you release all your patents and you make 10 times as much money. So I think it's really about how do we better advance the wisdom of the world, as well as understand how the company can advance. And I think peer review is a powerful vehicle. It gets the best marketing, it gets the best media, but it's hard. It's not easy because the peer review ecosystem has changed. It's made it much, much harder to get in data that's flawed, as it should, I think, data that's biased, or data that doesn't represent the true problem beyond the nature of the limited data collection or data set. So I think we must support rigorous research in the startup space, and we must help startup leaders understand the role and importance of using this platform to get their message out, to influence the marketplace, but most importantly, to make sure that their assumptions are being valid so that others can challenge, can play with, can support, and perhaps even find other partners that will work with them to advance their unique product, their way of thinking, or perhaps transform the whole marketplace.
Well, I'm very glad that you said that, because we do in fact have two leaders from startups. They happen to both be from Canada, but why don't we ask Keith Thompson what his perspective is on the subject?
Yeah, thanks, Tori. It's a great discussion, and taking notes and listening here as well as contributing. I think for startups, being involved in research is of critical importance, and I'm going to bring to you from the lens of a more evolved company. I'm currently with Neurologics right now as Chief Medical Officer, new to that spot. But I can tell you firsthand, when you start to do your pitch and you're going to a market, one of the things that's looked at is what's the research behind, or what is the evidence that your product does what it says it does. And there's internal research to develop that product, of course, which is good. But at some point, depending on who you're speaking to, they want to see that peer-reviewed, unbiased evidence, and it speaks volumes, I think. So you need to consider it in evolving your market. I think also there's a cautionary note that when you release or publish, careful that you're not giving away your secret sauce. Because if you don't have IP yet, you publish your research, of course, and it becomes public domain. So you don't want to give away your secrets, but at the same time, it is I think a strong foundation to build a market. And without it, I would say you're going to struggle, right? You may get so far up that vertical ladder in a market, but to really get into a larger space, you're going to need that peer-reviewed evidence.
Pierre, let's go to you, because I know you've published quite a bit in the marketplace. I think in both on the specialty and multi-specialty side too. So what are your perspectives here?
Well, I think it depends on the product. The closer you are from a clinical application, from medical decisions, the more rigorous and expensive and time-consuming that research will be. If you're just talking about a tool that's more on the administrative side, a white paper could be sufficient. But in most cases, what we find when you're looking to negotiate reimbursement, when you're looking to increase adoption, you need multiple tools in your toolbox, and the publications that come out of clinical research are important. Healthcare is a very conservative market for good and bad reason, but a lot of good reasons. You need to have evidence that your product works as you're selling it, and the people in front of you, if it's a physicians or chief medical officers looking at your solution to decide if they're going to adopt it, they need to be convinced by this evidence. Maybe one paper is sufficient. More paper is usually better as long as the quality is there. If you can work with research institutions that have a lot of credibility, it helps also. And so the more you have, the better. In our case, the good news, I think, for startups is that there's a lot of non-dilutive funding to conduct that type of research out there. So you don't have to fund everything yourself. Usually, you can get grants from the NIH, for example, from patient foundations, hospital foundations, and other organizations to support that research. Even large companies use that leverage to conduct clinical trials. So, of course, startups should use leverage and non-dilutive funding. But again, it depends on the product, and you need to start really with the problem you're solving and what is the evidence you need to prove to your next client that you're actually solving that problem.
That is great advice, Pierre. Thank you very, very much. And we'll come back to some of your points in a bit. Rob, I want to ask you this question. What is a publication plan, and does a company need one for larger programs, particular research outputs, for example? Would you advise a publication plan on a large scale or not?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's one that I love to answer, particularly because when you think about a publication, or at least when I started my career, I thought, okay, well, I finished a piece of research, and let me just find a quick journal, and I'll toss it into that journal, and I'll be done. But when we're thinking about it from a company perspective, it's a little bit more of a deliberate process, and you want to think more about what you're trying to accomplish. Who is your audience going to be, for example? What journals are available to you? And what are you trying to accomplish with each one of those particular publications? Oftentimes, research isn't a one and done. So you may think, okay, well, I finished a study and I'm just going to publish that one piece. But there may be different parts of the study that you want to publish in different places based on the audience you're trying to reach, or perhaps you want to tell different parts of that research story over time. So what I want everyone to think about is really that it really needs to be more of a deliberate process. As deliberate as you are about considering the research you're doing, you want to be thinking about the whole sequence of the plan. Typical publication plans include things like, well, what are the study endpoints or things that I'm trying to communicate? What are the potential target journals that I want to go to? What are the submission timelines for them, and so on and so forth. So you can start to think about how you strategically are going to lay out the dissemination of that research, of that evidence, in order to maximize its ability to reach other people.
Thank you. The next question, what should be considered when writing a manuscript example? What are the key guidance documents that they should follow, and where might a company or a founder be able to find them? Let's go to Paul with that one.
Well, I have a very simple formula that I ask when I review a paper, or when I submit a paper. Number one, why now? Number two, who cares? Number three, how will this piece of work make any difference to anybody in the world? And finally, why am I or my team, my startup, my team best suited to deliver this innovation? If you can't answer those four questions, then you really have to continue to dig in deeper. Those are my fundamental questions in thinking about a publication. The rest is just nuances, because at the end of the day, this is really about informing others about innovative way of thinking about things, doing things, framing things, perhaps a new way to make things. Again, agree complete with Keith's point is that you need to have control of your IP, particularly if it's primary type of data. But I'm impressed more and more in the last several years that the more you give things away, the more it comes back to you. And so we should think about that as well, particularly given that APC charges now of journals can be up to $11,000. And so clearly there's a quid pro quo there, which I know particularly irks Tori. And so hopefully we'll get to that a little later. But I think at the end of the day, I think of writing a paper like if you had over to dinner several colleagues and you went to tell them about your innovative product, and they would be asking you some tough questions. Does it work? How do you know? Under what conditions can others achieve very similar results? And will it have lasting benefits on your recipients, if it's a patient or a consumer or others? And I think those types of prisms or lenses, I think, are at the heart of what I look for in any type of research publication.
Thank you. Rob, do you have anything to add to that?
I think that's a great response. If I were to just dig in a little further, one of the things that comes to mind when you think about actually developing a manuscript, we often think about like who, from the starting point, who might be the authors of that manuscript. So a lot of times it's certainly the people, or it's always going to be the folks who are involved in the research, but sometimes there's people that are involved or very influential or important in the space that you want to involve in that research as a second look at that. And if you have them involved early on, they can serve as authors and important authors many times as you consider where you want to publish. The other thing I'd add is there are guidance documents that are available. I come representing the International Society for Medical Publication Professionals, which is a long title for a society that really works directly with helping people to know what resources are available for medical publishing. And so we offer something called Good Publication Practice. It's been updated 3 times so far. It's now in its 4th iteration, which will hopefully be available in a month or two. But that's a document that was published many times over and really gives kind of the overview as to what you need to consider when you're going to publish something in a medical journal, both from a how to do it best point of view, but also what are some of the pitfalls and areas of compliance that you have to be aware of. Because certainly this is a very regulated space, and there are things where if you start to make wrong turns, you can certainly get yourself in a bit of hot water.
It sounds like a great resource, and we'll make that available as well. Thank you. Gentlemen, let's turn this to Keith and to Pierre. I'm wondering what your unique experiences have been at your companies insofar as publishing research, and how more specifically, have you benefited, or your company? Pierre, do you want to take that first?
Well, Keith, you can start if you want. Well, I'll take it. So first of all, okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about the experience that we've had at Hexoskin. The first research projects we've supported was in 2012, and it was published in 2015. So it took some time to conduct the research and publish it, but it was very important because by the time we had our first paper, suddenly we could approach our clients with more confidence, because they didn't have to rely completely on us to trust the product. They could look at the paper and see that it was a research group, in a research center in a university that spent time on it, that validated the product against the gold standard, that can tell about how it compares to what is used and other products that could potentially do similar things, but in a lab environment. In our case, we sell wearable sensors, so they can be used in various contexts, and we were compared with an instrument that was to be used only in a lab. And then I'd like to talk about pre-market research and post-market research, and that was very important for Hexoskin. In that today we have about 150 papers published with our platform, but most of these papers have been published by our clients, not actually by us. And they were client-originated project and funded project. We were not really involved in writing protocols and defining outcomes and all that. And I think that's really important because in many cases in digital health, your first clients will also be organization with good funding, with good credibility, with prestige. And if you allow them to conduct research with your product and to collect data with your product by themselves, they might want to conduct that research and fund it themselves. And then you get that kind of crowdsourcing effect of letting your user publish their own literature about your product and recommend it or not, and add nuances on different contexts where they use your product, and they might find users for your products that you didn't think about before, and they might publish, and this might open a new market for you. So I think so. First of all, I think pre-market research is important. Early research is important because you need that validation to bring credibility to your organization. If you're going to sell a product and compete with large players that have sales reps in every health systems today, as a small organization, you absolutely need some papers. But then if you design your product so that people can extract data easily from it to publish papers that keep on validating your promises and keep generating evidence independently from you, I think you have a formula for growth.
That's great. And so that's a topic, actually, your clients and partners and collaborators also become your advocates in the marketplace.
Absolutely.
and can publish as well. And the research, just standing on its own, is continually enhancing the credibility and validating the product and services in the marketplace. Yeah. Keith, what are your thoughts now? What has your experience been?
So again, I bring a bit of a historical perspective. I'm new to the role here with the company, but coming in and seeing what the role had been for research, developing the product, and exactly as Pierre had said, now we're moving into those partnerships with research where we want to prove further intended use or clinical use or validating use becomes a different sort of relationship. I found in the role that I was in, the importance of the research actually led me to take the board certified medical advisor program. And I'm just fascinated by the acronyms you mentioned, good publication practice, GPP3, and all of that. And I can tell you that from my world, that it looks the publication, the research really does become that currency of exchange, really, to kind of deal with customers as your market evolves. And I think it really does, as we said, validate your market presence. But it's such an important role, right? And understanding, I think that solid research and that relationship between the research, between marketing and sales, it really is important, right? For someone to be that liaison between, even within the company, so that you're all on the same page. We've had, situations where you go into a customer encounter and, you start spewing to them stats and research data and they go fuzzy-eyed. Right? You start talking about other clinical use. So tailoring your research, right, to the customer you're talking to, or even being able to pull out those papers, right, that, hey, this is who I want to talk to. This is my value add for these folks. That may be a different package, say, than you're talking to an academic or a research center in a hospital.
All right, thank you. And actually, I want to highlight, because I think it's a great phase, currency of exchange, research being a currency of exchange. And I don't think any of us really consider it, have considered it in that regard in the past. And so I just think it's brilliant, and we're going to use it. And Paul also had a comment about it, actually. Paul, you just put a note in the chat. Do you want to share it with the rest of us?
Sure. So I want to continue off Pierre's comment. I can't emphasize the importance of having researchers work together with developers, but there is a problem there, and we have to acknowledge it. The problem is called bias. And so the real challenge, as Pierre alluded to early on, is that the company really wants to show that their product works, which is great. However, we have dozens of examples in which companies, without external insight and without the independence of evaluation, found results that could not be replicated by others. And so as we talked about the peer review research side, that's the publication side, but it's also about the research side. So the real challenge I find, Pierre, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, is, you know, I get asked by a variety of companies to advise them on doing research, and I regularly recommend that they help in designing the experiments, and then they step away from interpreting the results. And they don't like to hear that because they want to control the message. Not necessarily because they have nefarious issues, because they believe that, you know, this has been their baby for 10 years. The problem, of course, is that we have a lot of research to show that bias is not just obvious, but a lot of times it's inherent in how we frame and answer questions. And so if you've invested years and years of time and you're expecting a positive based on other types of data, then you're going to be going into this with a highly biased perspective. And so how do we develop early, rigorous opportunities in which we can evaluate the technology or the innovation in a way that addresses that bias up front, and allows us to have that community between researchers and technologists working together, but still have that independent outside voice. And so that is a conundrum. So I'm going to throw that back at Keith and Pierre, because I don't think there's any easy answers there, but I'm curious to hear your perspectives on that.
Yeah, I think what comes to mind is we're in the midst of a pre-submit for FDA. And so when you talk about validated evidence, and you know, we're setting up now clinical trials that will be independent, there's that trusted third party, right, that's going to look at how things are being approached. So that's incredibly important. I totally agree. I think if you really are to be transparent, and there's a greater push for this now, right? We look at algorithms and AI-based systems, you know, the FDA included, wants to look under the hood, show us your trade secrets. What are you doing? You know, is there racial bias in your programming? Is there social determinant biases? What's going on? So yeah, I think we're in a world where you can't budget, right? You're going to have to really measure up and do the hard road to hoe, and it's not going to be a simple in-house research project. It's going to be 40 or 50 subjects, right? You have to have more powerful studies, right, if you really want to move it forward.
There are also checks and balances in our system and industry, and Rob's group is one of those guidelines groups. So Rob, do you also want to speak to that subject?
Sure. I could probably spend quite a bit of time on that, but I'll just summarize by saying, you know, there's because there are sources of bias out there, and as I mentioned before, and a couple of the other folks did here today as well, because there are those factors involved, there needs to be guidelines for what gets done and when. So everything from, you know, making sure that you do choose the right authors and they're done in a particular manner. They have to meet certain criteria. We call them ICMJE criteria. Won't get into detail on that, but they exist, and it kind of gives a guidance or a way in which to think about whether or not a person has actually contributed appropriately to that manuscript. And you might say, well, why is that important? Well, because that's actually a source of bias. If you have people contributing to a paper, a manuscript, and they haven't been properly involved, or they're, you know, don't have a proper place in that byline, they can take the research in different ways and interpret it in different ways. So, and there's a lot of other guidances that way. We mentioned GPP, and certainly other things that we can put in place that help to detail out the way in which a manuscript should be developed. And I can't overemphasize that it's not just, it's not as simple as just writing a paper. You know, I mean, it can be on the surface, but if you're going to do it well and do it in a way that's going to be compliant and pass regulatory concerns, then it does need to be thought out in a very stepwise fashion, from first having the idea to who's going to be a part of actually drafting that paper, and then where it's going to go. Needs to be very, very disciplined in how it gets done.
And if I can add, Rob, on our side, on the journal side, and as a publisher, we're the only journals. Our two journals are the only journals in the marketplace, to my knowledge, that publish conflict of interest statements for staff, for editors-in-chief, for editorial board members, for peer reviewers, for everyone up and down that line. So when we're looking to take out bias, that is another area where a journal and publisher can add credibility to the process. But again, we're the only ones that do that. I will say COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics, is also looking at it now. So Pierre, I'll go to you to wrap it up.
I'd like to add some nuance on this. Again, it depends on the product you're working on. If you have a product that is looking for a digital biomarker that is very precise, you can work with the research team and you can do a lot of work to eliminate bias and make sure the participants that you're taking data from are representative of the target population, the final population that you want to serve, like that. But in many cases in digital health, the tools you're developing are also team dependent. And this makes it, I would say, harder to conduct clinical research to demonstrate the efficacy, because the same tool in two environments could lead to different results. So we have to be careful. And we've talked about bias. It's one thing, and you have to be very careful because you're going to use that research to get funding, to submit to the FDA. But then once you're in the market, other people are going to try to reproduce your results, and they're going to publish. And if you have not been honest, and if you have not been careful about these biases, they're going to know, and your project is not going to last. You know, it's not going to be something that will be used in 10 years, because in the first few years, people will already start publishing, and you're going to lose that credibility, and it's really hard to get back after that. And it's really hard to recover. So if you're in it for the long term and you really want to make a difference, I agree, you really want to take care of these biases and work and do work that is as objective as possible.
So we bring it all back to honesty is the best policy.
I think so.
Yeah.
Well,
and thank you.
Honesty declared, but independently verified.
Even better,
Absolutely.
Paul. Thank you. So is there, when is it okay not to publish? Just throwing that out there.
When it's badly done,
Mhm.
highly biased, undersampled, and poorly protected. So, you know, that, and it would seem to me that would be the reason why. But of course, that's assuming that it's not such a trade secret that will highly influence your IP. So going back to Keith's early comment, that would be a reason to not publish until you had the coordinates of protection around it.
Well, IP issue aside, there are papers that do come in with doing exactly that, frankly, Paul. You know, and again, we get back to the peer review process and vetting, and ultimately rejecting a paper that is really weak. And really doesn't bring much to the table, and isn't reproducible. And, you know, I could go on and on. So Rob, question for you. You will likely agree with Paul, and the peer review process. Again, you know, we're vetting out the weakest links, if you will. But would you add anything to that or no?
I said it well. One of the things that we have to think about, though, is, as we were saying earlier on in the conversation, it's not always as apparent once something gets submitted to a journal that there's actually been an issue that would cause it to not merit publication. So That being the case, if you're a researcher or you're working for an organization and you produce some research and you notice that there's some kind of flaw in the methodology, or there's something that happens where once it's published, the results could be misinterpreted in a way that the public could be at risk or something along those lines, or it could turn science in a way that would have other people making false conclusions or things like that, that would be a time when you'd say, well, maybe this shouldn't be published because it's not going to do the better good. But most times, even when you find negative results, it's actually very helpful to the scientific world in general to publish those results, because it shows how something shouldn't be done or how what things don't work, and it helps to steer other pieces of research that other people may be doing. So there's almost an ethical obligation to publish almost everything that you come across, barring some of those IP issues we talked about before, as well as flawed methodology.
And I'm so glad you brought that up, because we've discussed this very subject, and so have Paul and I. But those negative results, really no one wants to publish negative results. And if they do, it's in some obscure journal that's read, somewhere in the Himalayas, frankly. And so how do we get the scholarly community, or really any community, comfortable with sharing negative results, failed results? I mean, just the connotation of those two words alone, just reverberates. So what can we do, and what would we advise a startup, considering, Pierre's comment earlier, honesty being the best policy. And there are journals out there that I believe just publish negative results, but how can we make the market more comfortable publishing negative results? Paul, do you want to take that one?
Sure. There's only one fail-safe way, and that is that you require everybody who gets any type of funding to publish the results, and that's required now by the NIH. So you cannot do a clinical trial that's funded by the US government and any of its entities without publishing your results, and the EU is about to follow suit. So I think that at a minimum means that if you're getting public funding, at the minimum, you should make those data available. For all the reasons you've mentioned, so much more, which is, later on when you try to do a meta-analysis or you look at conflicting data, at the end of the day, even if the method is reliable, what you're seeing is only what's available, and so you don't get to see the rest. So that's one. The second thing I think is being open-eyed about the fact that even though something isn't published doesn't mean it's not out there negative, and so assume that there is a lot of negative data, and that means being more reflective and honest about the fact that when you don't see something published, don't assume that it hasn't been done. Assume it hasn't been positively done. And that's a different way to educate researchers and media and others to be much more careful about, not publishing something as a form of information, if you will. And so it could be because it's never been done, or it could be because it was negative. And so I think that requires an increased level of professionalism by people who do research, report on research, fund research, and ultimately consume research, is realize that there is a natural bias not to talk about negative things.
Pierre, I'm curious as to what your experience has been with negative data, most particularly.
Well, there's negative data, but I'd like to take a step back and talk about the question, when is it okay to not publish? Because I feel like we're setting a very high standard right now. And if you're a startup, you have to take into account time. If you're the CEO or the chief science officer or chief medical officer of a startup, you don't have tenure. You have a runway. And that runway is not 5 years. And it might take 5 years to get funding for a research project, recruit participants, go to ethics, and run the project, write the paper, submit it, get rejected, submit it again, maybe get rejected again, then resubmit it, and then they're going to sit on it for 6 months before they publish it. And when you're a startup, 5 years is It's a lot of time. It's a very long time. You don't have funding for 5 years. So what do? You might want to publish partial results at some point. You might want to publish some of these results in a white paper or marketing brochure while you wait for peer-reviewed papers to come out. You have to be pragmatic about it. And also there's a question that most of the clinical trials you're going to start are going to fail to produce any result. And it's not only true for startups, it's true for large pharmaceutical companies as well. Most clinical trials just fail to recruit the number of participants they're designed for. So to have one peer-reviewed paper that is very good, you might have to start 3, 4, 5 projects, and it takes a lot of time. So it's very challenging. I don't want to lower the bar for medical evidence. I think what has been said is important, because at some point that's what you need to operate in a market and work with hospitals, for example. But I want to be pragmatic and give the point of view of the startup. You don't have a lot of time. Most of these projects are going to fail. At some point, you're going to have to make the most of what you have. Even if it's not going to be sufficient to convince everybody, but it might be sufficient to convince a few early adopters that can get you traction while you get additional evidence published. And in the end, for the long term, to go beyond the early adopters, you'll need to have that body of evidence, which means not only one peer-reviewed paper, but at some point, a number of papers that are published independently, research that is being run independently from your company to be able to reach customers beyond these early adopters.
So it's very interesting that you bring that point to light, Pierre. The bar is high. It is the healthcare marketplace that we're playing in, but the being comfortable with failure and expecting failure, and that being part of the equation of success even, is something that we don't necessarily process that in our minds that way. So I'm glad you brought that point up. Keith, was there something that you wanted to add there?
I was just sort of listening and thought, the carrot and the stick, right? Why would we publish negative results? And the stick being the regulatory force upon us. Thou must, you're publicly funded, you better. But the carrot really is, an opportunity to network and network with those key opinion leaders. So even in a negative result, this is an opportunity for you to reach out, connect with others in your field, in your area, show your interest, question their story. If you're on a Zoom webinar, ping a question, get to know who's leading in this research. And can I tell you my experience? I want to hear your story. So it's a great opportunity, I think, to open some other doors, even with a negative result.
So back to the collaborators and advocates, frankly. Yeah. We're wrapping it up. We're getting close now, but how do you maximize visibility for articles and your research? So let me go to Pierre, because I see you on social media, certainly in journals. How do you maximize those efforts?
Well, in our case, with Hexoskin, most of the research is published by our clients independently from us and in various journals. What we try to do is to find the publication that have more impact and I share it on social media. Sometimes we share it in our mailing list. We do things very organically, very grassroots. We organize webinars where we invite researchers who have published peer-reviewed papers to talk about it, to give a short talk about what they've done and how they have used our product successfully to get their results. Oftentimes these results are not even about our products. They're about what our product enables. In terms of the type of research they can conduct, because they're using our sensors and our connected platform to conduct research. So, the way I see it, the best, you as a company, as a startup, you shouldn't talk a lot about your product. You should be talking about the success your users have with your product, solving the problem they have. And that's the best marketing. And the more we can amplify the word of mouth and these experiences, these positive experiences from our clients, the more it sets an example, and it allows other people to see what they can do with our products and to consider it in their plans.
Great, thank you. Paul, what are your thoughts there? How do you, that's because you're writing, I think you just submitted an article, not to our journal, but another. So how do you and fellow authors maximize visibility?
Well, I think there's common vehicles like abstracts and proceedings and chapters and papers. Then there's vehicles to talk about those results like social media and other aspects, obviously public talks. The challenge sometimes is that some journals will punish you if you release your results before it gets published by the journal, which is a deep ethical conundrum that we won't go there, but we need to mention that. But I want to talk about the other issue which COVID opened up, which is the unreferred preprints, which perhaps is a blessing, but mostly I think is a danger. At least a third of those papers have been retracted over time. And I think a lot of people publish a lot of stuff that wasn't particularly good, that wasn't particularly ethically sound, that wasn't scientifically well done. And they flooded the market in such a way that before I was tracking, I don't know, say 5,000 articles a year, I had to track 100,000 articles a year, which of course is not possible. So the other problem with this mass dumping, because it was dumping, is the fact that it was really hard to know what's good and what's not. And so we are in a reckoning period now of what is the best way to get information out, particularly when it's time sensitive and of public interest. And is that same calculus the same one for a 5 to 10 year vision that Pierre was talking about? Does that only apply to public emergencies of 3 to 6 months? This is really hard. And so I'd say we need to have a deeper conversation about that question. What are ways to get it out there? And if those ways don't undermine the veracity and integrity of the external evaluation of the process, then we should encourage that. But we should remember about the perverse forces, including pharmaceutical companies that publish their data and all in media dispatches and not in public articles, at least for a year and a half after their vaccine science came out. That was a serious abrogation of decades of agreement that that's not how we accept science. And so this is a serious problem, and there are no easy answers now, but I do think we have to talk more about that question. Is it okay to share your science when the marketing officer is the person who's writing the scientific release? Is that an acceptable way to advance science in 2022?
That's part of the reason why we, at our annual meeting, we don't allow marketers or salespeople to speak, and we don't accept press releases, and on and on and on. And so, Rob, I'm going to go to you to wrap it up, if you will. We have a couple of minutes left. How would you advise maximizing visibility for papers and research in the scientific community as well as beyond the scientific community?
Yeah, I think the starting point is, and I'll divide the answer into two parts, right? One is, and I'll keep it brief. One is the medical publishing piece, and it's something Paul started talking about originally. It's, making a good choice about the journal that you're going to go to and how which is the most appropriate journal. So it starts with the core publication, and that should be done appropriately. It should be done in a ethical manner. You shouldn't have your marketing person, for example, drafting that publication or being involved in it. But picking the right journal, we often divide them up into tiers that may or may not be necessary, but it's more about making sure you're picking the right journal for the audience you're trying to reach. And sometimes that's not a quote unquote top tier journal or the one that has what we call the highest impact factor. It may be a lower impact factor or a more specialized journal, but those are the people that you want to reach. So that's the publication piece. And then the second part is the medical communications piece, right? Which is once you have that core foundational publication and it's peer reviewed and it's credible, there's other ways that you can talk about that piece and get it beyond your core audience of readers of that journal. So things like social media. Keith had talked a little bit about key opinion leaders, KOLs. There's this whole brand of digital opinion leaders, right? So folks that are out there running around the internet and they're looking at research and they're creating more and more noise. You want to be careful in those scenarios, right? Because those are people that can be very positive about the data you produce, or can also, with one tweet, derail the whole thing. So when you're thinking about what you want to do from a publication communication plan, it's important to think not just about the visibility of that publication and trying to get that right, but also what happens once it's out there. Because with the internet and so on and so forth, your research will be not read just in the journal, but it'll be read in all kinds of third-party outlets that come well beyond that. And you need to think about that sequence and what happens once it gets further beyond the journal itself.
Thank you so much. So we're going to wrap it up now. It's that time. And we will follow up with another webinar in the series, but I'd like to take the time to thank you all today, Keith, Robert, Pierre, and our own Dr. Barak, for your contributions, certainly your invaluable guidance. And we'll look forward to getting feedback from the marketplace once this goes live. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
Tori. Bye, everybody.
We appreciate your tuning in to the Partners in Digital Health Institute Startup and Early Career Incubator Writing Bootcamp. Thanks for listening in today. To keep up with webinars, podcasts, and other tools for your career and business, join the Partners in Digital Health Institute at pdhinstitute.com and click Join. To learn more about ISMPP, please visit ismpp.org, join, and engage with programs available. Stay tuned for our next session, coming soon.